This is the beginning of part 2 of the Esoteric Bible, chapter 11. 1830 to 1850, the Tree of Displacement. By the early 19th century, the systems that had taken root were no longer forming. They were expanding. What began as influence and control in earlier periods had now developed into large-scale restructuring of land, labor, and identity. The effects were no longer subtle. They were visible, enforced, and difficult to reverse. This period marks a phase where displacement becomes organized, not isolated, not accidental, structured. One of the clearest examples is the forced removal of indigenous populations from their land. Policies were put in place that justified relocation under the language of progress and development. Entire communities were moved under harsh conditions, with little regard for continuity of culture or life. Land was not just territory, it was memory. It held language, tradition, and a way of understanding the world that had been built over generations. When people were separated from it, the disruption went beyond geography. It affected identity itself. At the same time, the system of slavery continued to expand and solidify. Labor was extracted at scale. Human beings were categorized, controlled, and reduced to function within an economic structure that prioritized output over humanity. This was not hidden. It was normalized. Legal frameworks supported it. Economic systems depended on it. Social structures reinforced it. The combination of displacement and forced labor created a pattern. Movement without consent. Work without ownership. Identity without self-definition. These patterns did not exist independently. They were connected. As land was taken, it was repurposed. As systems expanded, they required labor. As labor was controlled, identity was redefined to justify that control. This is how the tree grows. The root has already been established. Now it produces visible results. The introduction of industrial systems during this period adds another layer. Production becomes more efficient. Output increases. Systems become more complex, but the underlying structure remains the same. Control. The methods evolve, but the principle does not. People begin to move from land-based life into system-based life. Work becomes more centralized. Time becomes more regulated. The rhythm of life changes. The shift is often framed as progress. In some ways it is, but progress without balance creates new forms of limitation. As systems grow, individuals can become more dependent on them. Skills that were once distributed across communities become concentrated in specific roles. Knowledge that was once shared becomes specialized. This creates efficiency. It also creates vulnerability. Because when people rely on systems they do not fully understand, they lose the ability to operate outside of them. This is where the long-term effect becomes clear. Displacement is not only physical, it is also structural. People are moved from one way of living into another, often without full awareness of what is being lost in the process. Over time, the new system becomes familiar, the old one becomes distant. Eventually, it is remembered only in fragments. This is how forgetting deepens, not through a single event, but through repeated shifts that moves people further from the original reference points. By the mid-1800s, the tree is fully visible. The patterns are established. The effects are widespread, but like any structure, it is not permanent. Pressure continues to build. Contradictions become harder to ignore, and the conditions that have been created begin to lead toward further change. Understanding this period is important because it shows how systems scale, not just in size, but in impact. It shows how ideas move from theory into lived reality. And it shows how patterns that begin in one context can expand into many. The tree of displacement did not grow overnight, and it does not disappear quickly. But recognizing its structure is the first step in understanding how it continues to influence the present. Chapter 12, 2000, the digital shift and the new flood. By the end of the 20th century, another shift was already underway. It did not arrive through conquest or visible expansion. It arrived through connection. The rise of digital technology changed how information moved, how people interacted, and how knowledge was assessed. What once required physical presence or controlled distribution could now travel instantly. At first, this appeared to be a solution. Access increased, communication expanded, barriers that once limited the flow of information began to break down. But as with every shift, there were layers. What increases access also increases volume. Information did not just become available, it became constant. This is where the idea of the flood returns, but in a different form. Not water covering the earth, but data covering attention. Streams of content, updates, messages, and opinions move continuously. There is no clear beginning or end. Everything is present at once. In that environment, the challenge is no longer finding information, it's filtering it. When everything is available, value becomes harder to determine. Important and irrelevant information appear side by side. Clarity and distortion are presented in the same space. This is a different kind of pressure, not physical, but cognitive. Attention becomes fragmented, focus becomes difficult to maintain, depth is replaced by speed. People are not only consuming information, they are adapting to its pace. Over time, this changes how thinking works. Shorter cycles of attention, faster reactions, less time spent examining what is being presented. This creates a condition where influence can operate more easily. When people move quickly from one idea to another, there is less opportunity to question, compare, or verify. Patterns can be introduced and reinforced without being fully examined. At the same time, the digital environment creates a sense of participation. People can respond, share, and contribute. But participation does not always equal understanding. In many cases, it increases noise, more voices, more perspectives, more interpretations. Without a structure for discernment, this does not lead to clarity. It leads to saturation. This is where the parallel to the flood becomes very clear. In the earlier story, survival depended on what was preserved within a defined structure. In this environment, survival depends on something similar, not physical containment, but mental structure. what you allow in, what you prioritize, what you choose to engage with, and what you ignore. Without that structure, everything blends together. Truth and distortion becomes harder to separate. Reaction replaces reflection. The speed of information begins to dictate the pace of thought. This is not inherently negative. The same systems that create overload also create opportunity. Knowledge that was once difficult to assess is now available. Connections that were once unlikely can now form easily. But the outcome depends on how the system is used. Without discernment, it overwhelms. With discernment, it can be navigated. The shift around year 2000 did not change technology. It changed the environment people think within. And like any environment, it influences behavior. Understanding that influence is necessary, because once you recognize the conditions you are operating in, you can begin to adjust how you move through them. You do not need to disconnect completely, but you do need to be intentional, to slow down when everything speeds up, to focus when everything fragments, to question when everything presents itself as equally valid. The flood is no longer external. It is constant and immediate. And what carries you through is not avoidance. It is structure. What you build internally determines how you move within it. And that determines what remains clear and when everything else is not. Chapter 13. 2025 and beyond the turning point. Every system reaches a point where it can no longer expand in the same way it once did. It either adapts, fragments, or is restructured. The present moment reflects that kind of pressure. The patterns described earlier are not separate events. They are phases of the same process. Formation, expansion, stabilization, disruption. Each phase builds on the last. What makes the current period different is the level of visibility. Information is widespread. Communication is immediate. Perspectives that were once isolated are now accessible. This does not automatically create clarity, but it does increase exposure. More people are encountering ideas that challenge what they previously accepted without question. Systems that once operated with minimal scrutiny are now examined more closely. At the same time, uncertainty increases. When established structures are questioned, there is often no immediate replacement. This creates a gap between what is no longer fully trusted and what has not yet been clearly defined. That gap can be uncomfortable. It can also be productive because it forces a shift from passive acceptance to active consideration. People begin to ask different questions, not just what is presented, but how it is presented. Not just what is true, but how truth is determined. This is where discernment becomes more than a concept. It becomes necessary. The pace of change contributes to this. Technological development continues. Social structures evolve. Information cycles accelerate. What was stable 10 years ago may no longer feel stable now. This is not necessarily a collapse. It is a transition. But transitions are rarely smooth. They involve adjustment. They involve reevaluation. And they involve a period where multiple possibilities exist at once. In that environment, it is easy to move toward extremes. Some respond by holding tightly to existing structures, resisting any change. Others move in the opposite direction, rejecting everything that came before without fully understanding what they are replacing it with. Neither approach leads to clarity. One preserves limitation, the other creates instability. The alternative is more measured. Recognize what is no longer functioning, understand why it is not functioning, and take the time to determine what should be carried forward and what should be left behind. This is not a fast process. It requires attention, it requires patience, and it requires the ability to remain steady while conditions shift. The idea of a turning point is often associated with a single moment, but in practice, it is usually a period, a stretch of time where direction changes gradually, even if it feels sudden in retrospect. We are within that kind of period now, not at the beginning of the cycle and not at the end, in the middle of the shift. What comes next is not predetermined in a simple way. It will be shaped by how individuals and systems respond to the conditions that are present. This is where the focus returns again, not to large systems alone, but to individual awareness within them. Because large changes are often the result of many smaller decisions. What people accept, what they question, what they build, what they choose to participate in. These decisions accumulate. Over time, they form patterns, and those patterns influence direction. The turning point is not something that happens outside of people. It is something that develops through them, in how they think, and how they act, and how they respond to what they encounter. Clarity will not come from waiting for a final answer. It will come from engaging with the process carefully, observing without rushing, questioning without reacting, and building without relying entirely on what already exists. The conditions are changing. That much is clear. What is not yet clear is how those changes will settle. But that uncertainty is not a weakness. It is an opening. And what is done within that opening will determine what follows. Chapter 14. Guarding the Field of the Mind. All of the patterns described so far return to one place, the mind. Not in an abstract sense, but in a practical one. Every system, every idea, every influence eventually reaches the individual through thought. What is accepted, repeated, or acted on begins there. This is why the parable of the field is not only external, it is internal. The mind functions as a field where different kinds of input are constantly being introduced. Some of it is chosen, some of it is not. Information, conversations, media, and personal experiences all contribute to what takes root. Not all of it holds the same value. Some ideas lead to clarity. Some create confusion. Some appear useful at first, but do not produce anything sustainable over time. The difficulty is that these differences are not always obvious immediately. As with the wheat and tares, early stages can look similar. This is where attention becomes important. What you focus on grows. Not because of preference alone, but because attention reinforces patterns. The more something is repeated mentally, the more familiar it becomes. Over time, familiarity can be mistaken for truth. This is one of the primary ways distortion takes hold. Not through force, but through repetition. Guarding the mind does not mean avoiding all external input. That is neither practical nor necessary. It means being aware of what you allow to stay. There is a difference between encountering something and internalizing it. You will hear things you do not agree with. You will see information that is incomplete or misleading. That is part of the environment. The key is whether those inputs become part of your internal structure. This requires a level of observation, not reacting immediately, not accepting automatically, allowing space to evaluate. Questions become useful here. Is this consistent? Does this produce clarity or confusion? Does it hold up over time, or does it require constant adjustment to make sense? These are not complicated questions, but they are often skipped. Speed works against them. In fast-moving environments, people respond before they reflect. They absorb before they examine. Over time, this leads to accumulation without structure. Many ideas, but little coherence. Guarding the field is about restoring that structure, choosing what to build on, letting go of what does not hold, and understanding that not everything requires engagement. Some things are better observed than left alone. This also applies to internal patterns. Thoughts are not always intentional. They can be influenced by past experiences, habits, and external input that has been repeated over time. Not every thought needs to be followed. Some need to be examined. Some need to be dismissed. The ability to distinguish between them is part of maintaining clarity. This is not about perfection. It is about consistency. Small decisions repeated over time shape the overall condition of the mind. What you return to regularly, what you give attention to, what you reinforce, these determine what grows. The field does not remain empty. Something will always take root. The only question is whether it is chosen or left to chance. Guarding the mind is not a one-time action. It is an ongoing process, quiet, often unnoticed by others. But it has a cumulative effect, because once the field is clear, what grows within it becomes easier to recognize. And once that recognition is consistent, discernment becomes less of a concept and more of a habit. Chapter 15. Breath and Awareness, Returning to Center. When everything becomes fast, attention becomes scattered. Information moves quickly, decisions are made quickly, reactions happen before there is time to fully understand what is being responded to. In that kind of environment, it is easy to lose a sense of center, not in a dramatic way, in a gradual one. Focus shifts outward, attention is pulled in multiple directions, the eternal reference point becomes less stable. This is where something simple becomes important. Breath. It is often overlooked because it is constant. It does not require effort to begin. It does not demand attention. It continues whether it is noticed or not. But when it is brought into awareness, it changes how everything else is processed. Breathing does not solve problems directly. It creates space. That space allows for a pause between stimulus and response. It slows the immediate reaction just enough to introduce choice. Instead of reacting automatically, there is a moment to observe. That moment is small, but it matters, because within it you can decide how to proceed. Without it, most responses are habitual. They follow patterns that have already been established. With it, there is an opportunity to adjust those patterns. This is not about technique, it is about attention. Noticing the breath as it is, allowing it to continue without forcing it, using it as a reference point when everything else feels unstable. This brings awareness back to the present, not as an idea, but as an experience. What is happening right now without layering additional interpretation on top of it. That clarity does not need to be held constantly. It only needs to be returned to repeatedly. Over time, this builds consistency, the ability to step back from immediate reaction, the ability to observe without being pulled into every passing thought, the ability to respond rather than react. This is where alignment begins to stabilize, not through control of everything external, but through awareness of what is happening internally. Breath is a simple entry point into that awareness. It does not require belief. It does not require explanation. It only requires attention. In a world where most things are designed to pull attention outward, this becomes a way to bring it back. Not permanently, but reliably. Each time you return to it, you reinforce that connection. Each time you pause, even briefly, you create space for clarity. This is not separate from the earlier ideas, it supports them. Because discernment requires space, clarity requires time, and both are difficult to maintain when attention is constantly divided. Breath provides a way to restore that balance, quietly, without interruption, available at any moment. It does not replace thinking, it supports it. By giving it the room it needs to function clearly, and in that space, the difference between reaction and understanding becomes easier to see. Chapter 16. Water and memory, what you hold and what you carry. Memory is not only something you think about, it is something you carry. Not every experience stays at the level of conscious recall. Some of it settles deeper. It influences how you respond, how you interpret situations, and how you move through the world, often without direct awareness. This is where the idea of water becomes useful. Water does not hold shape on its own. It takes the form of whatever contains it. In the same way, memory adapts to the structure it is held within. If the structure is clear, memory can be processed and understood. If the structure is unstable, memory can become distorted, fragmented, or difficult to assess. This is not about physical water. It is about the way information and experience are stored internally. Some experiences are easy to process. They are understood, integrated, and placed in context. Others are not. They remain active in the background. They influence reactions without being clearly identified. Over time, this creates patterns. Similar situations trigger similar responses, even when the context is different. This is how memory shapes behavior. Not by controlling every action, but by influencing the default response. The challenge is not that memory exists. The challenge is whether it is understood. Unexamined memory can create automatic reactions. Examined memory can create informed responses. This is where awareness becomes important again. Not to revisit everything repeatedly, but to recognize when something is influencing the present more than it should. Questions help here. In this response, based on what is happening now or on something that has already passed, is the intensity of the reaction aligned with the situation or amplified by something else? These questions do not eliminate memory. They create separation between the past and the present. That separation allows for choice. Without it, past experiences can dictate current behavior without being recognized. This does not require constant analysis. It requires recognition at key moments. When something feels disproportionate, when a reaction seems automatic, when a pattern repeats without clear reason. These are points where memory is active. Bringing awareness to them allows for adjustment. Over time, the changes how memory is carried. It becomes less reactive and more informative. It provides context without overwhelming the present. This is not about removing memory. It is about organizing it. Understanding what belongs where. Allowing what is relevant to remain accessible. Allowing what is no longer useful to settle without continuing to influence behavior. Chapter 17. Fire and transformation, pressure that refines. Most people associate transformation with sudden change, a breakthrough, a realization, a moment where everything becomes different all at once. Sometimes that happens. More often, transformation works slowly. It develops through pressure. Fire is a useful metaphor for this because fire changes the condition of whatever passes through it. Sometimes things weaken under heat. Others become stronger. Impurities separate. Hidden structure becomes visible. Pressure has a similar effect on people. Not all at once, but over time. Difficult periods reveal patterns that are easy to ignore when conditions are comfortable. Habits become more visible. Priorities become clearer. Weak foundations begin to show strain. This is why challenge often produces clarity. Not because struggle is inherently valuable, but because pressure removes distraction. What matters becomes easier to identify. What does not hold, it begins to fall away. Most people try to avoid pressure entirely. That response is understandable. No one activity seeks discomfort without reason, but avoiding all pressure creates a different problem. Without resistance, there is little refinement. Skills remain undeveloped. Awareness stays untested. Internal structure remains fragile because it has never been challenged directly. This does not mean hardship should be glorified. Not all pressure produces growth. Some situations are destructive rather than constructive. The difference often comes down to whether something is shaping you or consuming you. Fire can refine metal. It can also destroy what is unstable. Understanding that distinction matters. Transformation is not about enduring endless difficulty for the sake of it. It is about learning how to move through pressure without losing alignment. That requires stability, not perfection. Stability. The ability to remain connected to what matters even when conditions become uncertain. This is where people often discover whether their foundations are solid. Ideas that sounded convincing in a comfort may not hold under stress. Beliefs that were repeated easily may become difficult to maintain when tested directly. Pressure exposes this, not to punish, but to clarify. The process can feel uncomfortable because refinement involves separation. What is unnecessary begins to fall away. What is inconsistent becomes difficult to maintain. This can happen internally as much as externally. Old patterns lose their grip. Reactions that once felt automatic begin to feel out of place. Priorities shift. Over time, a different structure begins to form, more intentional, more stable, less dependent on appearance. This process rarely looks dramatic while it is happening. Often it appears slow. Small adjustments repeated consistently, choices made differently over time, responses becoming more measured, awareness becoming clearer. Eventually, the change becomes noticeable. Not because someone declares it, but because the structure underneath has actually changed. This is why transformation cannot be reduced to emotion alone. Feeling inspired is temporary. Refinement is sustained. It continues after the emotional moment passes. Fire also produces light. That part matters. Pressure does not reveal weakness. It can also reveal capacity. Abilities that were previously undeveloped, strength that was not visible under easier conditions, clarity that only emerges once distraction has been reduced. This is why some people come through difficulty with more depth than they had before. Not because the difficulty itself was good, but because they learned how to move through it without losing themselves completely inside it. The goal is not to become hardened. It is to become clear. Strong without becoming rigid, aware without becoming reactive, steady without becoming closed. This is what refinement produces when it is approached correctly. Not a different person entirely. A more aligned version of the one that was already there. In closing, the return to remembrance. Every cycle has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But what most people do not realize is that endings are not final. They are transitions, moments where one state dissolves and another begins. This book has walked through many layers: scripture and symbolism, history and displacement, consciousness and awakening, practice and embodiment. But none of it matters if it stays on the page. The purpose of this work is not information. It is transformation. We are living in a time where information is everywhere, yet clarity is rare. People know more than ever, but understand less. They are connected to everything, yet grounded in nothing. This is not accidental. It is the natural result of a long cycle of forgetting. But just as forgetting has a cycle, so does remembrance. And that cycle has already begun. You can see it in the questions people are asking. You can feel it in the discomfort many are experiencing. You can hear it in the quiet shift away from blind belief toward direct understanding. This is the beginning of discernment. Not everyone will recognize it. Not everyone will choose it. But those who do will notice something subtle yet undeniable. A return to simplicity. A return to truth. A return to self. Not the surface identity shaped by the world, but the deeper awareness beneath it. That is where remembrance lives. You do not need to chase it. You do not need to prove it. You only need to become still enough to recognize it. The wheat has always been there. So has the tare. The difference now is that you can see the field clearly. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. From this point forward, the responsibility is yours to choose what you cultivate, to choose what you consume, to choose what you become. The world will continue as it always has, full of noise, distraction, and competing narratives. But within that noise, there is still a quiet voice, not loud, not forceful, but steady, guiding. And if you have read this far, then you have already heard it. Trust that. Because this is where the journey truly begins. Back to heart frequency.